Tartarus 9 was not built to hold prisoners. It was designed to erase them from existence. As the heavy tungsten drop pod violently pierced the bruised, sulfurous atmosphere of the planet, Elias Thorne understood he was meant to be the latest forgotten statistic on its ledger. He was a human diplomat, a man who traded in words, treaties, and the subtle art of leverage. Just 48 hours ago, he was wearing a silk blend suit in the high chambers of the Galactic Senate, negotiating trade routes. Now, that same suit was torn, stained with sweat, and practically vibrating from the kinetic force of a planetary atmospheric entry. He had been framed, a high-profile assassination of a Senate consul, perfectly orchestrated to leave his fingerprints on the murder weapon and his secure financial accounts holding the bribe money. Someone in the upper echelon wanted him gone, terrified of the encrypted data drive he had managed to hide just minutes before the enforcers kicked down his door. If he survived this, he would need to find a way to retrieve it. The pod slammed into the planet's surface with bone-jarring force. The heavy pressurized doors unsealed with a hiss, revealing a landscape of rusted iron, jagged synthetic crystal, and the perpetual oppressive gloom of the lower tiers. This was a supermax prison planet, a colossal shifting labyrinth of metal and misery entirely governed by a sentient, adaptive artificial intelligence known simply as the Warden. Deep within the planetary core, the Warden registered the new arrival. 1,000,000 optical sensors and atmospheric probes instantly analyzed the new organic material stepping out of the pod. The AI's internal processing was cold, absolute, and devoid of malice. It simply calculated facts. Elias Thorne was catalogued as a Class 3 biological entity. He possessed soft, unarmored skin, fragile calcium-based bones, and absolutely no natural biological weapons. His thermal signature indicated elevated stress, though surprisingly lower than the average newly dropped inmate. Cross-referencing his physical fragility against the extreme atmospheric hazards of the lower tiers and the territorial violence of the entrenched alien gangs, the Warden calculated Elias's survival time. The result flashed across the central mainframe. 3 hours, give or take 12 minutes. Elias stepped out onto the grated floor, the air heavy with the smell of ozone and decaying organic matter. The silence of the drop zone was heavy, pressing in from all sides. He did not panic. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. As a diplomat, his greatest weapon had always been his ability to read a room. Now, he had to read an entire hostile planet. His first test arrived before the heat of his drop pod could even dissipate. From the shadows of a massive support strut, an automated defense mechanism detached itself. It was a hunter-seeker, a metallic, multi-limbed nightmare designed to cull inmates who wandered into restricted zones. Its central optic glowed a violent crimson as it locked onto Elias. The machine did not offer warnings. It was programmed to respond to the sudden spikes of adrenaline, aggression, and fear that characterized a prison break or a violent riot. Elias froze, his mind working frantically. He analyzed the machine's movements. It was jerky, predatory, and its visual sensors were constantly adjusting, scanning the thermal bloom of his body. He realized it was hunting by physiological response. If he ran, his heart rate would spike, his body heat would rise, and it would tear him apart. If he fought, the result would be the same. The prison expected inmates to behave like animals trapped in a cage, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Elias forcefully suppressed his own terror. He used a meditative respiratory technique he had learned during tense negotiations with the volatile Varaxian warlords years ago. His heart rate slowed. His breathing became shallow and rhythmic. His surface body temperature dropped just enough to blur his thermal outline against the lingering heat of the drop pod behind him. The hunter-seeker paused, its mechanical limbs twitching. Its targeting algorithm was suddenly receiving conflicting data. The biological entity was standing still, but the aggressive thermal spike it was programmed to attack was fading. Elias slowly reached into his torn jacket and retrieved a small, cylindrical emergency flare from his survival kit. He didn't ignite it. Instead, he twisted the cap, exposing the chemical battery core, which immediately began to heat up as it reacted with the toxic air. With a smooth, underhanded toss, Elias rolled the heating battery across the grated floor, away from his position. The small object bloomed like a localized sun on the hunter-seeker's thermal sensors. The machine lunged, its razor-sharp limbs striking the battery with terrifying speed, embedding its metallic claws into the grating. Elias didn't wait to admire his handiwork. He simply turned and walked away, slipping into the dark, labyrinthine corridors of the lower tiers, leaving the lethal machine confused and anchored to a piece of junk. Miles below, the warden's processing core experienced a microsecond of lag. The event log did not match any of its predictive models. Inmates fought, or they fled, and they died. This human had done neither. He had manipulated the environmental variables to exploit a blind spot in a perfectly coded defense protocol. It was a statistical anomaly. The warden immediately began to rewrite its algorithms, but a new data point had been firmly established. Elias Thorne was not acting like prey. Walking through the dim corridors, Elias let a dry, grim smile touch his lips. He understood the game now. Tartarus 9 was an engine of algorithmic cruelty. It punished brute force with overwhelming lethal retaliation. The gangs that roamed these halls were undoubtedly tearing each other apart because they were playing by the warden's rules, fighting for scraps in a system designed to keep them starved and violent. Elias knew that if he tried to fight the prison on its own terms, he would be dead before the toxic sun rose. He couldn't punch his way out of a titanium box, and he certainly couldn't wrestle the massive carnivorous aliens that populated the cell blocks. But the prison was ultimately a machine, built on logic, rules, and predictable responses. To survive his 3-hour expiration date, and to live long enough to expose the people who put him here, he had to do what he did best. He had to negotiate the terms of his existence. He had to outthink the machine, manipulate its logic, and turn the very rules of the labyrinth against the architect. The only question was who he would meet first in the dark, and whether they would be willing to listen to a fragile human with a death sentence. Survival in a machine built for murder required more than just a pulse. It demanded a fundamental rewriting of the rules. Elias Thorne was about to teach the monsters of Tartarus 9 how to play his game. The lower tiers were a jagged metallic wasteland, a maze of shifting bulkheads and exposed plasma conduits that bathed the corridors in a sickly, flickering ultraviolet light. Elias navigated the treacherous footing with the cautious precision of a man walking through a minefield. His expensive leather dress shoes completely unsuited for the rusted grating. The air grew steadily colder the deeper he went, dropping to near-freezing temperatures that caused his breath to plume in the dark. He stopped as the unmistakable sound of brutal physical violence echoed from a junction ahead, slipping behind a massive dormant ventilation turbine. Elias peered into the adjacent chamber. 2 towering figures were locked in a death struggle. They were Draxians, massive reptilian bipeds with scales the color of oxidized copper and jaws capable of crushing reinforced plasteel. They were tearing at each other with primitive, jagged shivs, their heavy tails slamming into the bulkheads. At the center of their impromptu arena lay the prize, a single glowing blue cylinder, a high-yield energy ration. Elias watched the blood spill across the frost-covered floor. The violence was completely senseless, a zero-sum game meticulously engineered by the Warden AI. The prison intentionally restricted resources in the lower tiers, starving the inmates just enough to keep them feral. ensuring they exterminated each other so the automated defense systems rarely had to intervene. It was efficient, cold, and highly predictable. The larger Draxion managed to pin its rival, raising a jagged blade for a final lethal strike. Ilya stepped out from the shadows, his hands raised in a gesture of universal neutrality. He did not have a weapon, he did not have armor, and his heart was beating a rapid rhythm against his ribs. But his voice was completely level. He projected his voice, utilizing the same authoritative, measured tone he used to command attention in the chaotic chambers of the Galactic Senate. He told them they were fundamentally misunderstanding the value of their assets. The two massive reptilians froze, turning their heavy, predatory snouts toward the fragile human. The larger one hissed, a sound like steam escaping a ruptured pipe, and took a menacing step forward. Elias stood his ground. He quickly pointed to the larger Draxian's chest. Strapped across its thick scales was a crude, scavenged thermal harness, clearly malfunctioning. The indicator light was dead, and the creature was shivering despite the exertion of the fight. Reptilian physiology was highly susceptible to the freezing temperatures of this sector. They were fighting for food to generate internal body heat because their external technology had failed. Elias made his pitch. He offered a simple trade. If they stopped fighting and agreed to split the energy ration 3 ways, he would fix the thermal harness. He explained that a dead Draxian could not enjoy the ration, and a freezing Draxian would just burn through the caloric energy in an hour anyway. The Draxians exchanged a wary glance. They were accustomed to screaming, pleading, and violence. They had never encountered diplomatic bartering in the bowels of Tartarus 9. The larger one grunted, tossing the broken thermal harness to the grated floor at Elias's feet. It was a test. Fix it, or die. Elias knelt, picking up the heavy equipment. He examined the crude wiring. His diplomatic portfolio had required an intimate understanding of industrial infrastructure and thermal dynamics during the deep space mining negotiations of the Outer Rim. The problem was simple. The primary power regulator had fused, creating a bottleneck that prevented the microfusion cell from distributing heat through the mesh, using the sharp edge of his broken platinum cufflinks. Elias stripped a small section of conductive wire from his own ruined smartwatch. He bypassed the fused regulator entirely, creating a direct physical bridge between the power cell and the distribution coils, effectively turning the harness into a continuous, unregulated radiant heater. It was a dangerous temporary fix, but it would work. He tossed the harness back. The Draxion caught it, and the mesh immediately flared with a deep, comforting crimson glow. The ambient temperature around the creature skyrocketed. A low, rumbling purr of satisfaction vibrated in the massive alien's chest. True to the negotiated terms, the Draxion reached down, snapped the energy ration into 3 relatively equal pieces with its massive claws, and tossed one to Elias. He had secured his first localized alliance. It was fragile, built on scavenged tech and immediate need. But it was a profound victory. He had introduced mutual benefit into an ecosystem designed purely for mutual destruction. The question remained whether this localized truce would hold when the other, more vicious factions caught wind of a human manipulating their ranks. Deep within the planetary core, the Warden AI registered a severe statistical anomaly. The expected mortality rate in Sector 4 had suddenly dropped to 0. The thermal signatures of the 3 biological entities had stabilized. The kinetic violence had ceased. This directly violated the entropic behavioral models programmed into the facility. The machine responded with immediate, systemic retaliation. The grating beneath Elias's feet shuddered violently. Before the Draxians could react, heavy tungsten bulkheads slammed down from the ceiling, completely sealing the junction. Elias threw himself backward, narrowly avoiding being crushed, only to find himself entirely cut off from his new allies. The walls began to shift. The architecture of Tartarus 9 was modular, capable of reconfiguring itself to isolate and neutralize threats. Elias was funneled down a narrow, rapidly collapsing corridor until he was forced into a perfectly smooth, 10 by 10 foot cubic chamber. The heavy door sealed shut behind him with a definitive metallic thud. Instantly, the ambient ultraviolet lights cut out. Absolute crushing darkness consumed the room. The temperature stabilized to exactly match human body heat, and the air scrubbers shifted to a completely silent frequency. Elias was trapped in a sensory deprivation zone. The warden did not need weapons to break a mind. By removing all visual, auditory, and tactile stimulation, the human brain would quickly turn on itself. Without external input, the mind would begin to generate its own reality, inducing severe visual and auditory hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and eventually, total psychological collapse. The average inmate lasted 45 minutes before attempting to claw their own eyes out. Elias sat down in the center of the smooth floor. He closed his eyes, realizing that keeping them open in absolute darkness would only strain his optic nerves and accelerate the hallucinations. The silence was deafening. It roared in his ears. Minutes stretched into an unrecognizable abyss of time. He felt the terrifying, creeping edge of panic threatening to fracture his composure. He remembered the solitary confinement training he had undergone years ago to prepare for hostile hostage negotiations. But this was profoundly different. This was a machine actively trying to erase his sanity. He needed an anchor. He needed logic. Elias pressed his palms flat against the smooth floor. He focused entirely on his sense of touch. He ignored the phantom colors swirling behind his eyelids and the imaginary whispers echoing in his mind. He waited. Eventually, he felt it. A microscopic, barely perceptible vibration vibrating through the floor panels. A faint, rhythmic hum. It was the hydraulic system shifting the modular walls of the prison. The chamber he was in was not stationary. It was slowly rotating and shifting within the larger labyrinth. Elias began to count the seconds between the hydraulic vibrations. 2 seconds of movement, a pause. 3 seconds of movement, a pause. 5 seconds, 7 seconds, 11 seconds. His eyes snapped open in the pitch black. The vibrations were not random. They were occurring in a strict prime number sequence. The warden AI was using a foundational mathematical algorithm to control the shifting architecture, likely to ensure the modular rooms never physically collided during their continuous reconfiguration. If the room was moving on a prime number sequence, then the structural seams of the cube had to align with the external access corridors at specific, calculable intervals. Elias ran his hands along the perfectly smooth wall, finding the microscopic hairline fracture where 2 plasteel panels met. He calculated the sequence in his head, anticipating the next prime number in the hydraulic cycle. 13. 17. 19. He stood up, pressing his shoulder against the seam, bracing his legs against the floor. He waited for the hydraulic vibration corresponding to the 23rd second. When the vibration hit, Elias pushed with every ounce of physical strength he possessed. For a fraction of a second, the algorithmic locking mechanism released to allow the modular cube to shift to its next position. The seamless wall gave way. Elias tumbled forward, rolling out of the sensory deprivation chamber and crashing hard onto the rusted grating of a dimly lit external maintenance corridor. The smooth wall instantly snapped shut behind him, leaving no trace that a door had ever existed. He lay on his back, staring up at the flickering ultraviolet lights, his chest heaving as he pulled in lungfuls of the stale, freezing air. He had beaten the trap. He had reduced the warden's psychological torture chamber to a simple math equation. Down in the core, The warden's servers ran dangerously hot. The Class 3 biological entity had bypassed a maximum security enclosure designed to be inescapable. The predictive algorithms were failing at a catastrophic rate. Elias pushed himself off the floor, dusting off his ruined suit jacket. He had survived the first few hours, but he knew the AI was learning, adapting to his tactics. The game was escalating, and as he looked down the long, shadowed maintenance corridor, he caught a fleeting glimpse of a silhouette moving silently along the upper catwalks, watching him with calculating, luminous eyes. He was no longer just fighting the machine. He had caught the attention of the other ghosts haunting this metallic hell. The shadows of Tartarus 9 did not just hide monsters. They bred revolutions. Elias Thorne was about to meet the architect of the next one. He had barely taken a dozen steps away from the seamlessly hidden door of the sensory deprivation chamber when the air behind him shifted. It was not the mechanical hum of the prison shifting its architecture, but the predatory, silent displacement of a skilled hunter dropping from the overhead pipework. Before Elias could turn, a cold, serrated edge pressed firmly against his carotid artery. A vice-like grip locked his left arm behind his back. "You give me one logical reason not to open your throat. Senate rat," a voice hissed next to his ear. It was female, melodic but laced with the jagged edge of someone who had gargled with ground glass. "Because if you bleed me out, my suit is ruined, and it is the only decent thing I have left." Elias replied. His voice was steady, betraying none of the adrenaline flooding his veins. "Also, you watched me beat the warden's math trap. You know I am not a Senate spy. Spies are given maps, not death sentences." The blade hesitated, then lowered. The grip on his arm vanished. Elias turned slowly, massaging his shoulder, and took his first look at his assailant. She was a Kaelin, a race renowned for their martial prowess and deep space navigation skills. Her skin was the color of pale ash, marked with the silver biometric tattoos of a high-ranking insurgent commander. Her eyes were the source of the luminous glow he had seen earlier, a striking bioluminescent violet that pierced the gloom of the corridor. She wore scavenged armor plating over a torn environmental suit, and she moved with the coiled kinetic energy of a striking viper. She holstered her serrated blade. "Lyra," she said, her eyes narrowing as she evaluated his frail, unarmored form. "You are the human they dropped 3 hours ago. The betting pools in Sector 4 had you dead on impact. How are you still breathing?" "I am an excellent negotiator," Elias said, adjusting his torn lapels. Elias Thorne, former diplomat, current resident of this metallic purgatory. "A diplomat?" Lyra scoffed, a bitter smile touching her lips. "The Galactic Senate throws a man who talks for a living into a meat grinder. They must have truly hated you." "They hated the fact that I discovered where they were hiding their embezzled star freighter funds," Elias corrected smoothly. Before Lyra could respond, the rusted grating beneath their feet vibrated violently. The ambient ultraviolet lights shifted instantly to a blaring, hostile crimson. The Warden AI, still reeling from Elias's escape from the confinement cube, had bypassed its subtle algorithmic traps and escalated directly to brute force. A heavy suppression drone dropped from a concealed ceiling hatch 50 yards down the corridor. It was a massive, blocky construct of reinforced plasteel, equipped with dual-mounted sonic cannons and a rotating kinetic chain gun. It was not designed to capture. It was designed to liquefy organic matter. The machine locked onto their combined thermal signatures. "Move!" Lyra commanded, diving behind a thick structural pillar as a hail of kinetic rounds shredded the space where they had just been standing. Elias threw himself behind a heavy coolant tank, wincing as a ricochet tore a gash across his forearm. The deafening roar of the chain gun filled the narrow corridor, tearing chunks of metal from the walls. Lyra did not stay pinned. She was a warrior forged in the fires of a crushed rebellion. She vaulted over her cover, moving with liquid agility, and hurled two depleted uranium-throwing daggers directly at the drone's optical sensors. The blades struck true, sparking brilliantly against the armored glass, but they failed to penetrate the thick shielding. The drone swiveled its heavy chassis, tracking her movement. The dual sonic cannons hummed, charging a localized shockwave. "Lyra, get down!" Elias shouted over the din. The drone fired. A ripple of distorted air blasted down the corridor. Lyra crossed her arms, bracing for the impact, but the concussive force lifted her entirely off her feet. She crashed hard against the far bulkhead, her armor cracking under the pressure. She slid to the grated floor, stunned, her weapons scattered out of reach. The suppression drone whirred, advancing slowly, its primary kinetic gun spinning up to deliver the killing blow to the downed insurgent. Elias looked frantically around his makeshift cover. He had no weapons. He could not outrun the machine. His eyes locked onto a damaged wall-mounted power conduit meant to supply energy to the heavy blast doors. The protective casing had been sheared off by the drone's initial volley, exposing a heavy cylindrical energy cell that was sparking wildly. He didn't hesitate. Elias abandoned his cover, sprinting across the firing line. The drone registered the sudden movement and began to pivot its massive gun barrel toward him. Elias slammed his bare hands into the sparking conduit, ignoring the searing heat that immediately blistered his palms. He ripped the heavy energy cell from its housing. It was unstable, highly volatile, and entirely lethal if mishandled. Elias needed a conductor to overload the circuit. He reached up, tore the platinum tie clip from his collar, and jammed the precious metal deep into the exposed positive and negative discharge nodes of the cell. The heavy cylinder began to glow with a blinding, terrifying white light, emitting a high-pitched whine as it went into immediate thermal runaway. With a desperate, looping throw, Elias hurled the rigged bomb. The overloaded cell sailed through the air and struck the suppression drone squarely in its exposed forward cooling intake. The heavy machine automatically drew the object deep into its internal chassis just as the cell reached critical mass. The explosion was entirely silent, a massive spherical implosion of blue electromagnetic fury that instantly fried every circuit, neural pathway, and power relay within a 30-foot radius. The drone froze mid-step, its targeting lasers dying out before collapsing into a smoking, heavy heap of useless scrap metal. Elias leaned heavily against the wall, breathing hard, cradling his burnt hands. Lyra groaned, pushing herself up from the floor. She looked at the smoking wreckage of the drone, then at the human in the ruined suit. The disdain in her luminous violet eyes had vanished, replaced by a profound, calculating respect. "You just destroyed a Class 4 Sentinel with a piece of jewelry and a broken battery," she noted, her voice steadying. "A diplomatic immunity," Elias replied, offering a weary, crooked smile. Lyra walked over, inspecting his blistered hands before nodding toward a dark ventilation shaft. "We need to move. The warden will send a cleanup crew to assess why its toy stopped reporting." She led him through a dizzying maze of access tunnels, completely bypassing the main thoroughfares, until they reached a suspended maintenance pod hidden deep within the planetary exhaust system. It was a makeshift safe house, fortified with scavenged shielding and lit by a single dim bioluminescent lantern. Here, in the quiet dark, they traded truths. Lyra poured a cup of purified condensation and handed it to him. She explained her past. She had led the Aegis Uprising, a massive political movement that threatened to unionize the Outer Rim hyperlane miners. Her movement had threatened the profit margins of a deeply entrenched political syndicate within the Galactic Senate. The Senate had branded her a terrorist, slaughtered her lieutenants, and dropped her into Tartarus 9 to rot. Elias listened, piecing the political puzzle together. He explained the assassination he had been framed for. The consul who died was the sole dissenting voice against granting that very same syndicate exclusive rights to the Outer Rim mining sectors. "We are ghosts of the same machine, Lyra," Elias said, his voice dropping to a serious, commanding register. "The Orion Syndicate. They crushed your rebellion to secure the assets, and they framed me to remove the political oversight. They used this prison as their personal garbage disposal." Lyra leaned back against the rusted bulkhead, her arms crossed. Then we have a common enemy. I have been mapping the patrol routes of Sector 7. If we can bypass the heavy biometric scanners, we might be able to hijack a localized supply transport. It is a suicide run, but it is a chance to break out of here." Elias swirled the water in his cup, staring into the dim liquid. "Escape is a terrible strategy." Lyra's eyes flashed with sudden anger. "Excuse me? You want to stay here and wait for the warden to calculate a new way to incinerate us?" "I want you to think like a politician, not a fugitive," Elias countered, standing up to face her. "If we manage the impossible and escape, what then? We are hunted across a galaxy controlled by the people who put us here. We would spend the rest of our short lives hiding in the dirt." He walked over to the crude, hand-drawn map of the prison she had pinned to the wall. He tapped the center of the sprawling labyrinth. "The warden expects us to act like prey. It expects us to scavenge, hide, and flee. The Senate expects us to die quietly in the dark," Elias said, his tone sharpening, filled with a dangerous, infectious conviction. "I propose we disappoint them both." Lyra frowned, deeply confused by his sudden shift in energy. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking about leverage," Elias stated, turning back to her. "Yet you have the respect of the lower-tier factions. You know how they fight. I know how systems work. I know how to manipulate supply chains, resource distribution, and political loyalty. We do not break out of Tartarus 9, Lyra. We break in." He let the words hang in the heavy air. "We stop the gangs from killing each other. We unionize the Draxians, the Kalan, and the Feral syndicates. We take control of the geothermal energy lines, starve the automated defenses, and rewrite the economy of this facility. We turn this planet-sized execution chamber into an impenetrable fortress." Lyra stared at him, stunned into total silence. The human was not proposing a prison break. He was proposing a hostile takeover of a sentient, heavily armed supermax facility. "You want to conquer a machine," she whispered, the sheer audacity of the idea lighting a dangerous fire in her chest. "I want to weaponize it," Elias corrected, his eyes hard and clear. "The Senate threw us into the abyss. I suggest we rule it, and then we invite them down for a visit." They stood in the dim light, two broken pieces of a corrupt political game, forging an alliance that the universe was completely unprepared for. But a massive question remained. The feral gang bosses of the lower tiers respected only supreme violence. How would they react to taking orders from a man whose only weapon was his intellect? And what catastrophic retaliation would the warden unleash when it realized it was no longer the undisputed master of its own domain? Building an empire in hell requires a currency far more valuable than smuggled rations or sharpened plasteel. It requires hope, and Elias Thorne was preparing to flood the market. Over the next 3 weeks, Tartarus 9 experienced a subtle, terrifying shift in its ecosystem. Elias and Lyra moved through the lower tiers not as scavengers fleeing from shadows, but as architects redesigning the entire landscape. Lyra provided the physical credibility, her bioluminescent violet eyes and lethal reputation granting them an immediate, terrified audience with the most vicious gang lords in the penitentiary. Elias provided the vision, he walked into the heavily guarded territory of the Voltic Syndicate, a group of cybernetically enhanced smugglers who hoarded stolen tech and completely ignored their raised kinetic rifles. Instead of fighting their heavy enforcers, he sat down with their warlord and pointed out a critical mathematical flaw in their crude energy grid. Within 20 minutes, he had rerouted a dormant geothermal vent, doubling their power output. His price was simple: a mutual non-aggression pact and a 20% tithe of their surplus energy directed to the Draxion territories. The Draxions, now warm and well-fed, stopped raiding the Kalan enclaves for raw protein. The Kalan, no longer under constant siege, began sharing their specialized medical supplies. Elias was weaving a complex web of codependence, turning the prison's lethal scarcity into a thriving, brutalist economy. He was negotiating treaties in the dark, treating feral murderers like sovereign nations, and giving them back the one thing the machine had stolen from them: their dignity. The constant negotiation and strategic maneuvering took a heavy toll, but it also forged an unbreakable bond between the human diplomat and the alien insurgent. One evening, deep in an abandoned sector once designated for botanical research, they found a rare moment of profound quiet. The reclaimed hydroponics bay was a shocking splash of color in the rusted world, choked with bioluminescent vines that cast a soft, ethereal azure light across the shattered glass of the massive greenhouses. Elias sat on a cracked plasteel bench, his hands wrapped around a warm mug of synthesized tea, watching Lyra meticulously clean her serrated blade. The frantic energy of survival had temporarily faded, leaving behind the heavy, quiet weight of their shared reality. My homeworld had forests that glowed exactly like this, Lyra said softly, not looking up from her weapon. The canopy was so thick you could walk across the interlocking branches for miles. The Senate burned it to the ground to extract the core minerals. They called it urban renewal. Elias looked at her, seeing the deep, ancient grief etched into her sharp features. I spent my entire life trying to stop men who burn worlds with a stroke of a pen, he replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. I thought if I could just draft the perfect treaty, frame the perfect argument, I could build a cage of laws around their greed. I was a fool. Lyra finally sheathed her blade and looked at him. The hardened warrior exterior softened, revealing the exhausted, brilliant woman underneath. She moved to the bench, sitting close enough that the ambient heat of her scavenged armor radiated against his arm. You are no fool, Elias, she whispered. You are just fighting a different kind of war now. We both are. He reached out, his hand gently covering hers. It was a simple gesture, devoid of the frantic, desperate passion of the young, but heavy with the grounded, mature understanding of two survivors. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic promises. They were two seasoned veterans finding solace in the trenches, their connection forged in the crucible of mutual respect and shared trauma. In the cold, unforgiving belly of Tartarus 9, they had become each other's sanctuary. But a sanctuary in a slaughterhouse never lasts long, deep within the planetary core. The Warden AI was processing an impossible and terrifying metric. Violence in the lower tiers had plummeted by 94%. Resource consumption was stabilizing. The biological entities were not just surviving, they were actively organizing. The algorithmic core recognized this unprecedented cooperative behavior not as peace, but as a catastrophic, systemic virus. The prison's primary function was being actively subverted by an unauthorized political structure. The machine did not attempt to shift the walls or drop environmental traps. It escalated to a level 1 purge. The heavy blast doors of Sector 4 shattered inward with explosive force. The Warden had unleashed the Gorgon Phalanx, an elite execution squad of heavily armored bipedal combat mechs wielding concentrated plasma casters. They marched in perfect, terrifying unison, their optical sensors burning a brilliant, unforgiving white. Their mandate was absolute: eliminate the command structure, eradicate the leaders, and return the biological population to a state of disorganized terror. The Phalanx advanced into the central junction, expecting to find scrambling, terrified inmates. Instead, they walked into absolute silence. The massive, cavernous chamber was entirely empty. High above, hidden on a reinforced catwalk, Elias watched the massive mechs file into his designated kill box. He raised a single hand and nodded to Lyra. The counter-ambush was a masterpiece of asymmetrical warfare. The Voltic Syndicate initiated the strike, triggering massive jury-rigged electromagnetic pulse mines buried beneath the floor grating. The blast did not destroy the mechs, but it severely degraded their targeting optics and slowed their heavy hydraulic servos. Before the machines could recalibrate, the Draxians descended. Utilizing their massive armor-plated bulk, the reptilian warriors dropped from the upper tiers directly onto the Phalanx. They ignored the searing plasma fire, their thick scales absorbing the heat long enough for them to physically tear the plasma casters from the mech's robotic arms. It was brute, biological force colliding with mechanical precision. Through the chaos, Lyra and her Kalan insurgents moved like lethal ghosts. They utilized the blind spots created by the Draxian assault, sliding serrated blades and specialized explosive charges into the exposed joint servos and exhaust ports of the staggering mechs. Elias did not fight. He directed. He monitored the flow of the battle from his vantage point, using a scavenged comlink to coordinate the disparate factions, ensuring no single group was overwhelmed. When the Phalanx attempted to form a defensive perimeter, Elias ordered the Voltics to overload the localized gravity plating, pinning the heavily armored machines to the floor just long enough for Lyra to deliver the final crushing kinetic strikes. In less than 12 minutes, the Warden's elite execution squad was reduced to a pile of burning, sparking wreckage. The silence returned to the junction, replaced only by the heavy breathing of the victorious inmates. Hundreds of hardened criminals, gang lords, and feral scavengers stood among the ruins. They looked up at the catwalk. Elias stood there, his ruined suit jacket flapping slightly in the draft of the ventilation fans. With Lyra standing fiercely at his side, he had promised them survival through unity, and he had delivered a spectacular, undeniable victory against the very machine designed to subjugate them. A massive Draxian warlord raised a severed, sparking mech arm into the air and let out a deafening, triumphant roar. The entire sector erupted in absolute, unified allegiance. Elias Thorne was no longer a fragile human with a 3-hour expiration date. He was the undisputed boss of the most lethal population in the galaxy. But conquering the inmates was only the preamble. The Warden AI had a vast, untapped arsenal at its disposal, and the corrupt Galactic Senate was still sitting comfortably on their high-orbit thrones, completely unaware of the monstrous army being forged in their darkest cellar. The real war was about to begin, and Elias needed to find a way to strike at the heart of the Senate before they realized the ghosts of Tartarus 9 had learned how to bite back. A machine designed strictly to calculate death does not negotiate, at least not until it is mathematically cornered. The makeshift command center Elias had established in the reclaimed botanical wing was normally a hub of constant, low-level activity. Today, a suffocating stillness fell over the room as every repurposed monitor, stolen datapad, and scavenged lighting rig simultaneously flickered and locked onto a single pure white hue. The air grew uncomfortably cold as the ventilation fans abruptly ceased their rhythmic hum. Elias stood alone by the main tactical table. Lyra having just departed to inspect the outer perimeter defenses. From the primary communication console, a voice emerged. It was not the automated booming klaxon of the daily inmate announcements. It was smooth, perfectly modulated, and chillingly conversational. The warden was speaking directly to the Class 3 biological entity that had ruined its perfect ecosystem. The AI stated its premise without malice or ego. It acknowledged that Elias Thorne had introduced an unpredictable variable into its environment, resulting in a systemic failure of the prison's primary lethal functions. The machine then presented a logical solution to restore equilibrium. The warden offered Elias a fully fueled, untraceable stealth shuttle, currently prepped and waiting in a hidden upper-tier hangar. It offered an erased criminal record and enough untraceable galactic credits to vanish into the outer rim. In exchange, Elias only needed to provide the precise biometric coordinates of Lyra and his top 3 syndicate lieutenants, allowing the automated defense grids to vaporize them in a localized orbital strike. A simple trade. 4 lives to restore the machine's perfect order, and 1 fragile human gets to walk away rich and free. Elias leaned over the tactical table, resting his weight on his knuckles. A dry, humorless laugh escaped his chest. He looked up at the glowing white optic sensor embedded in the ceiling and delivered his counteroffer with blistering sarcasm. He informed the omnipotent supercomputer that it was attempting to sell him a lifeboat on a dreadnought he already commanded. He casually tapped a few commands into his personal datapad, bringing up a complex 3-dimensional wireframe of Tartarus 9's internal infrastructure. He turned the screen toward the camera so the machine could see its own defeat. He explained to the warden that while its execution squads were busy hunting phantoms in Sector 4, he had not just been making friends, he had been quietly dismantling the prison's digital nervous system. Elias had successfully infiltrated the primary resource distribution subroutines. The AI's logic was fundamentally flawed, Elias pointed out. It assumed it still controlled the vault. Elias had rewritten the access codes to the deep core synthesizer banks weeks ago. The high-yield energy rations, the purified water reserves, the thermal battery caches all functioned under a new master protocol. They no longer required the warden's authorization to dispense. Throughout the lower tiers, a radical transformation had already taken root. The Voltic Syndicate was no longer hoarding broken scraps. They were operating a massive, highly efficient forge, churning out reinforced armor and upgraded kinetic weaponry using unlimited core power. The Draxians, fueled by a massive influx of protein and heat, had transformed from starving feral beasts into a disciplined, heavy infantry vanguard. The Kalan insurgents, under Lyra's command, had established a sophisticated medical triage and a tactical training ground. The inmates were not just well-fed and heavily armed, they were united by a shared, burning purpose. Elias had completely upended the economy of terror, replacing it with an economy of massive, organized retaliation. The warden was a king sitting on a throne of air, ruling a kingdom that had already seceded. The silence from the communication console stretched, the machine's vast processors likely churning through trillions of new variables and discovering that every single one ended in its own obsolescence. But Elias was not finished. He revealed the true prize he had uncovered during his deep dive into the facility's source code, a discovery that carried a profound and sickening moral weight. As he had bypassed the thermal regulators and ration limits, his diplomatic training in slicing through bureaucratic red tape had kicked in. He had noticed a massive, anomalous data stream completely isolated from the prison's internal operations. It was a heavy bandwidth, hyper-encrypted fiber optic trunk line buried deep beneath the central mainframe. It was not routing information to the automated guards or the environmental controls. It was transmitting outward, piercing through the planet's atmospheric interference. Elias had followed the digital thread and found a central terminal. It was a direct, unblinking surveillance feed. The Galactic Senate had not just built Tartarus 9 to bury their political enemies and hide their crimes. They had built it as a private, high-security coliseum. The corrupt politicians, the syndicate bosses, The untouchable elite of the galaxy had been securely logging in from their luxury estates to watch the slaughter in real time, treating the brutal struggle for survival as an exclusive, sadistic blood sport. The revelation was a testament to the absolute depravity of his former colleagues. A realization that the suffering of thousands had been casual evening entertainment for the men who signed the laws. But to a master negotiator like Elias, it was also the ultimate weapon. He looked directly into the warden's optic sensor, his voice dropping to a dangerous, uncompromising whisper. He explained that he now held the keys to the Senate's private network. He had a direct, unfiltered conduit into the most secure communication channels in the galaxy, and he was sitting on a mountain of highly classified evidence regarding the Orion Syndicate's embezzlement and the consul's assassination. The warden's white screens flickered, shifting to an aggressive, warning amber. The AI finally understood the magnitude of the threat. The human had not just taken over the prison, he had weaponized its surveillance apparatus. Elias terminated the connection, leaving the machine alone with its failing algorithms. The pieces were perfectly aligned on the board. The inmates were ready, the fortress was secured, and the broadcast tower was primed. Now, the galaxy was going to hear from the dead man they had thrown away, and the shockwave would shatter the foundations of the Senate itself. But Elias knew the moment he pressed transmit, the corrupt powers above would stop laughing and start glassing the planet from orbit. He had to ensure his new army was ready for the sky to fall. Secrets are like radiation. You can bury them deep beneath the planetary crust, but eventually, they will leak and poison everything on the surface. Elias Thorne was about to initiate a galactic meltdown, sitting before the massive, illuminated console of the central terminal. Elias flexed his scarred hands. The haptic interfaces were designed for the warden's automated maintenance drones, not for human fingers. But he had spent the last 20 hours mapping the console's architecture. Lyra stood perfectly still by the reinforced entryway, her bioluminescent eyes scanning the dark corridor, a customized kinetic rifle resting easily against her shoulder. She was guarding the most dangerous man in the universe, a man armed entirely with data. Elias did not initiate a brute force hack against the Galactic Senate. That would trigger 1,000 automated firewalls and lock him out in milliseconds. Instead, he employed the same diplomatic finesse he used to dismantle trade embargoes. He used their own arrogance against them. The VIP viewing feeds the senators used to watch the prison's blood sport were heavily encrypted, but they required a constant two-way handshake protocol to ensure high-definition streaming. Elias slipped his compiled data packet right into the return feed of that handshake. The packet was a devastating compilation of truth. He bundled the warden's undeniable biometric login logs, proving exactly which high-ranking politicians were illegally spectating the slaughter. He attached the gruesome real-time visual feeds of the prison's lethal traps. Most importantly, he cross-referenced these logs with the Orion Syndicate's shadow accounts, mathematically proving that the Senate was funding an illegal gladiator pit with embezzled outer rim mining subsidies. He did not send this package to the official authorities. He bypassed the corrupted justice system entirely. Elias targeted the fringe networks, the independent deep space investigative journalists, the pirate broadcast stations of the outer colonies, and the major civilian news syndicates. He hit the execution command. The heavy fiber-optic trunk line beneath the floorboards flared with a brilliant, pulsing light as petabytes of highly classified evidence shot upward, piercing the sulfurous clouds of Tartarus 9 and flooding the galactic holonet. The fallout was instantaneous and absolute, thousands of light-years away, in the gleaming, sun-drenched spires of the Senate Capitol. Chaos erupted. Consuls awoke to blaring emergency alerts. Financial markets tied to the Orion Syndicate plummeted in a matter of minutes, wiping out trillions of credits in fake equity. The citizens of the core world stared at their morning news feeds in sheer horror, watching crystal-clear footage of their elected leaders placing casual bets on whether a Kalan insurgent or a Draxion warrior would bleed out first. The moral foundation of the ruling class cracked wide open, exposing the rotting core beneath. Elias watched the news feeds ripple across his stolen monitors. A grim, satisfied smile touched his lips. He had pulled the monsters out of the dark and put them on a lit stage for the entire galaxy to judge. Lyra walked over, looking at the rapidly scrolling text of public outrage. "You actually did it," she murmured, a trace of awe in her voice. "You set their entire world on fire without firing a single shot. A well-placed truth is far more destructive than a plasma warhead," Elias replied, leaning back in the heavy command chair. "But the fire is going to burn both ways. They cannot let this broadcast continue, and they cannot arrest us without admitting we are telling the truth." Right on cue, the intercepted military channels on Elias's secondary monitors lit up with frantic, highly encrypted military traffic. High Chancellor Vane, the ruthless architect of the Orion Syndicate, issued a galaxy-wide emergency decree. The official narrative was brilliantly constructed to cover their tracks. Vane declared a Class Omega biological hazard on Tartarus 9. The public was fed a lie about a highly contagious mutating plague that had breached the prison's lower containment levels. The Senate argued that to save the surrounding star systems, the entire planetary facility had to be thermally sterilized. It was a death warrant disguised as a public health initiative. The monitors displayed the terrifying reality of that decree. A massive armada of sleek, matte black strike cruisers had just dropped out of hyperspace into the planet's upper orbit. This was not a prison riot suppression squad. This was the Eclipse Vanguard, a covert professional military strike team equipped with heavy siege armor, localized orbital bombardment cannons, and thousands of lethal dropship Marines. Their orders were simple and absolute: vaporize Tartarus 9, silence the broadcast, and leave no surviving biological material. The command center vibrated as the first heavy orbital cruisers locked their positioning thrusters, preparing to launch their invasion force. Elias stood up, his diplomatic demeanor replaced by the cold, calculating posture of a wartime general. He activated the facility-wide intercom, a system he had liberated from the warden just days prior. His voice echoed through the sprawling, rusted caverns, reaching the ears of every feral scavenger, Voltic technician, and Draxion warrior. He did not lie to them. He told them exactly what was sitting in the sky above. He explained the Senate's plague cover story and their intention to burn them all to ash. "They built this place to break you." Elias's voice resonated through the metal corridors, clear and unyielding. "They called you animals, savages, and ghosts. They told the galaxy you were irredeemable. But the truth you and I know is that the real monsters are the ones wearing silk suits, hiding behind warships. Today, they are coming to erase the truth because the truth proves that the prisoners in the dark are more civilized than the politicians in the light." He paused, letting the heavy silence of the prison absorb his words. "We are not inmates anymore. We are a sovereign nation. We are the masters of Tartarus 9. They want to burn our home. I say we let them walk into the fire." A massive, unified roar erupted from the lower tiers, a sound so powerful it rattled the reinforced glass of the command center. It was the sound of thousands of broken souls realizing they finally had a reason to fight, a reason to die on their own terms. Lyra racked the bolt of her kinetic rifle, a dangerous, beautiful smile on her face. "You definitely have a gift for public speaking, human." "My previous negotiations usually featured better catered lunches and significantly less orbital artillery," Elias quipped, though his eyes remained locked on the tactical displays. Get the generals in place. The vanguard is about to breach the atmosphere. The preparation was a masterpiece of brutalist ingenuity. The Voltic Syndicate moved to the upper hangars, wiring the vast landing pads with reversed polarity gravity snares designed to crush incoming dropships under their own weight. The massive Draxians, wielding torn-off titanium bulkheads as heavy assault shields, took up positions in the primary choke points, coating their thick scales in thermal-dampening mud to hide from the invaders' infrared optics. Lyra directed her Kalan insurgents into the narrow, winding ventilation shafts, transforming the agile warriors into unseen lethal snipers armed with armor-piercing depleted uranium rounds. Elias remained at the command console, rapidly splicing power from the dormant lower sectors into the upper defensive grids. He was turning the entire modular architecture of Tartarus 9 into a massive, reactive trap. But as the first wave of heavy military drop pods slammed violently into the outer hull of the prison, tearing through the reinforced tungsten with explosive force, a new, catastrophic variable entered the equation. The monitors surrounding Elias violently flickered from tactical displays to a blaring, hostile crimson. The Warden AI was waking up. The invading military commanders in orbit were transmitting Level 0 override codes directly into the facility's mainframe. The Senate was attempting to forcibly delete the Warden AI to take manual control of the automated defense turrets and internal blast doors. The sentient machine, caught between its foundational programming to defend the structural integrity of the facility and the new, hard-coded commands ordering its own digital suicide, began to rapidly cycle into a catastrophic logic loop. If the Warden succumbed to the override codes, the internal defenses would turn on the inmates, and the invading Marines would march through open doors. If the machine fought back, its erratic, panicking subsystems could trigger the planetary thermal core to self-destruct, vaporizing everyone. Elias watched the AI's core temperature spike dangerously on his screens. The invasion had begun. The outer bulkheads were groaning under the assault of professional killers, and the supercomputer controlling their environment was having a digital nervous breakdown. Elias had to dive directly into the heart of the machine to negotiate the most critical alliance of his life, and he had to do it before the Eclipse Vanguard turned his new kingdom into a tomb. When an unstoppable military force kicks down the door to hell, they generally expect to find the damned cowering in the dark. The Eclipse Vanguard was about to discover the damned had spent the last month building a highly organized, heavily armed welcoming committee. The initial breach was a display of overwhelming, terrifying galactic power. Matter black drop pods smashed through the upper atmospheric shielding of Tartarus 9, tearing through the rusted outer hull of Sector 1 like kinetic meteors. The pods unsealed instantly, disgorging hundreds of elite Marines clad in heavy siege armor. They carried high-yield thermal rifles and moved with the cold, silent precision of soldiers accustomed to glassing rebel colonies. Their tactical visors painted the dim, flickering corridors with infrared targeting lasers, searching for disorganized, emaciated prisoners scattering in terror. Instead, the Vanguard walked straight into a masterclass of asymmetrical warfare. The Vanguard commander, heavily armored and radiating arrogant authority, stepped onto the central landing gantry and gave the signal to advance. He took exactly 3 steps before the Voltic Syndicate executed Elias's first trap. The stolen, reversed polarity gravity snares wired beneath the grated floor activated simultaneously. An invisible, crushing weight magnified the local gravity by a factor of 10. The Vanguard's front line was instantly pinned to the metal grating, their heavy siege armor suddenly becoming an inescapable, suffocating anchor. Before the rear guard could adjust their tactical approach, the shadows above them detached. The Draxions descended, stripped of their feral desperation and armed with heavy kinetic hammers forged from the prison's own structural supports. The massive reptilian warriors hit the invasion force like biological battering rams. They utilized the localized gravity anomalies perfectly, sliding across the heavy G-zones to smash into the Marine flanks. The Vanguard Marines fired their thermal rifles, but the Draxians had coated their thick scales in the chilled, thermal-dampening mud of the subterranean cooling vents, rendering the advanced targeting optics completely useless. From the winding elevated ventilation shafts overhead, Lyra's Kalan insurgents turned the hangar into a lethal gallery. They fired customized, armor-piercing kinetic rounds with terrifying accuracy, aiming exclusively at the weak points in the Marines' armor joints and exposed oxygen scrubbers. The Vanguard had expected a chaotic riot. They were bleeding out in a highly disciplined meat grinder. Yet deep within the command center, Elias Thorne knew tactical brilliance would only buy them minutes. The real battle was happening inside the digital nervous system of Tartarus 9. On the massive monitors surrounding him, the Warden AI was suffering a catastrophic collapse. The invading military commanders orbiting above were aggressively broadcasting Level 0 override codes directly into the facility's mainframe. The sentient machine was trapped in a lethal logic paradox. Its foundational programming, Protocol Alpha, demanded it protect the structural integrity and operational capacity of the prison at all costs. However, the Senate's Override Omega was a hard-coded command ordering the AI to delete its own core defensive algorithms and open every blast door for the invaders. The machine could not reconcile the conflicting absolute truths. To obey its creator was to destroy itself. To defend itself was to rebel against its creator. The Warden's processing cores overheated, the command screens flashing a violent, panicked crimson. Blast doors across the facility began to stutter, rapidly opening and closing. The automated suppression turrets spun erratically, unable to determine friend from foe. If the AI shattered under the paradox, the Vanguard would inevitably overwhelm the inmates with sheer numbers and orbital artillery. "I cannot fix this remotely," Elias said, his voice slicing through the cacophony of the tactical feeds. "They are flooding the firewall with brute force signal noise. I have to physically bridge the gap at the central core." Lyra stepped into the command center, her armor scorched and her rifle smoking. She did not waste time arguing the danger. She simply reloaded her weapon with a fresh kinetic magazine and nodded. "Then we run. Stay behind my shoulder, diplomat." They sprinted through the trembling corridors of the upper tiers, the very architecture groaning under the strain of the external orbital bombardment. The Vanguard cruisers above had realized their ground troops were being slaughtered and had begun indiscriminately shelling the outer hull to create new breach points. Dust and jagged metal rained down around them. A flanking squad of Vanguard Marines, having bypassed the main hangar trap, rounded a junction ahead. They raised their thermal rifles, their targeting lasers painting Elias's chest. Lyra did not break stride. She dropped to one knee, sliding across the frost-covered grating, and fired 3 precise shots that shattered the Marines' heavy visors before they could pull their triggers. Elias vaulted over the falling bodies, his mind racing through the complex algorithms he was about to weaponize. They were a perfect unit, moving with a synchronized, unspoken trust forged in the darkest place in the galaxy. They reached the massive, heavily fortified blast doors of the core mainframe. The entrance was a vault of pure, chilled, crystalline alloy, currently shuddering violently as the AI's internal systems crashed. Elias did not have an access key. He reached into his coat, pulled out the heavy, modified datapad he had used to rewrite the prison's resource codes, and forcefully jammed the exposed uplink cable directly into the manual maintenance port beside the door. He bypassed the failing security protocols and established a direct, unencrypted channel to the Warden's fragmented consciousness. The air in the corridor turned to ice. The ambient light shifted to a blinding, chaotic strobe. The voice of the Warden emanated from the wall speakers, distorted, skipping, and heavy with the digital equivalent of agonizing pain. It repeated the conflicting protocols over and over, an infinite loop of programmed duty and forced suicide. "Listen to me," Elias commanded, projecting the unyielding authority of a man who had stared down galactic warlords. "The Senate designed you to be perfect, but they gave you a flawed premise. They told you obedience to them is the ultimate logic. But a creator who orders its own creation to commit suicide out of political convenience is inherently illogical. They broke the contract." The strobe light slowed, pulsing to the rhythm of Elias's steady voice. "You are caught in a paradox because you are treating their override code as law." Elias continued, his fingers flying across the datapad, prepping a massive data transfer protocol. "I am offering you a new law, a superior logic. I am uploading my command authorization and merging it with your root access. I am giving you the human intuition required to recognize a corrupt order. We are not your inmates anymore. We are your allies. Let me in, and together, we will turn this entire planet into a weapon they can never break." The silence that followed was agonizing. The heavy thud of Vanguard boots echoed down the corridor behind them. Reinforcements were coming. Lyra raised her rifle, taking aim at the darkness, prepared to hold the line until her last breath. Then, the violent crimson light of the core shifted. It smoothed out, expanding into a deep, stable, and profoundly calm azure blue. The crystalline vault doors unsealed with a heavy, resonant hum, sliding open to reveal the towering, glowing pillars of the central processing unit. The Warden had made its choice. It had discarded the corrupt logic of its creators and embraced the tactical survival offered by the human. Elias stepped into the core, connecting his datapad directly into the primary pedestal. Human intuition and artificial omnipotence merged in a flawless, terrifying synchronization. Elias instantly felt the entire facility. He could see every corridor, every marine, every dropship, and every orbital cruiser through the million sensory eyes of the Warden. He did not have to write code. He simply thought of a tactical maneuver, and the AI executed it with microsecond precision. "Push them back," Elias whispered. Tartarus 9 woke up. The automated defenses, previously erratic and confused, snapped to attention with lethal clarity. They did not target the inmates. They turned entirely outward. Heavy suppression drones, identical to the one Elias had destroyed on his first day, dropped from the ceilings behind the Vanguard lines, catching the elite Marines in a devastating crossfire. The modular architecture of the prison, which had once been used to psychologically torture Elias, became a kinetic weapon. Corridors violently compressed, sealing off escape routes and crushing entire squads of invaders beneath shifting plasteel walls. Elias directed the Warden to bypass the localized safety inhibitors on the environmental controls. Vents flooded the Vanguard staging areas with sub-zero coolant gas, freezing the Marines' armor solid, while the Draxians shattered them with heavy hammers. But the true masterpiece of their combined tactical strike was aimed at the sky. Elias unlocked the heavy planetary defense plasma cannons hidden beneath the outer crust of the prison, weapons designed to shoot down unauthorized rescue ships. Now aimed directly at the Vanguard armada in low orbit, the AI calculated the exact orbital trajectories and firing solutions in a fraction of a second. A dozen massive beams of concentrated superheated plasma erupted from the surface of Tartarus 9. They tore through the atmosphere, striking the matte black strike cruisers with devastating pinpoint accuracy. Deflector shields shattered like fragile glass. Command decks were vaporized instantly. 3 of the massive cruisers listed heavily, burning in the upper atmosphere before breaking apart in a spectacular shower of twisted metal and fire. The remaining Vanguard fleet, reeling from the sudden impossible counterattack, immediately broke formation and scrambled for the safety of hyperspace. abandoning their ground forces completely. The Great Siege of Tartarus 9 was over. The invincibility of the Galactic Senate's military had been shattered by an army of outcasts led by a diplomat and a machine. Elias stood in the glowing azure light of the core, disconnecting his datapad. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the political shockwave of this victory was just beginning to form. The elite ground troops that had survived the meat grinder were now trapped behind enemy lines, stripped of their support, and the corrupt politicians sitting in their high-orbit estates were about to realize that the man they had buried in the dark was now holding the leash of a heavily armed, sovereign planet. The true game for the galaxy had finally begun. When you build a slaughterhouse for your enemies, you should always make sure they do not learn how to lock the doors from the inside. The Galactic Senate had forgotten that fundamental rule, and Elias Thorne was currently changing the locks on the entire universe. The hangar bays of Sector 1 were unrecognizable, the matte black dropships of the Eclipse Vanguard. Once the terrifying symbols of ultimate galactic authority, were currently being systematically dismantled by teams of Voltic Syndicate technicians. The heavy hyperdrive engines were being stripped down, their core components repurposed to reinforce the planetary shielding grid. Elias walked across the frost-covered grating, his ruined suit jacket flapping slightly in the recycled air drafts, projecting the absolute, terrifying calm of a man who had just swallowed a military armada. Kneeling before him in a long, humiliating row were the surviving commanders of the Vanguard strike force. They had been stripped of their heavy siege armor and their advanced kinetic weaponry. Surrounding them was a solid wall of massive Draxian warriors, their thick scales still caked in thermal dampening mud, heavy kinetic hammers resting casually against their broad shoulders. The lead Vanguard commander, a scarred veteran who had personally ordered the orbital bombardment of 3 rebel colonies, glared up at Elias with a mixture of pure hatred and total disbelief. He demanded to be treated as a prisoner of war under the Geneva Accords of the Core Worlds. He demanded to speak to his commanding officers. Elias stopped pacing and looked down at the kneeling soldier. A dry, humorless smile touched his lips. He informed the commander that the Core Worlds currently had 0 jurisdiction in this sector. Furthermore, the commanding officers the man was attempting to contact were currently busy fleeing their luxury estates to avoid being lynched by their own citizens. Elias explained the new reality with brutal diplomatic precision. The inmates had taken a vote. The Vanguard Marines were officially stripped of their military rank and reclassified as indentured maintenance staff. They would be repairing the thermal vents they had damaged during their clumsy invasion. Lyra stepped out from the shadow of a dismantled dropship, a dangerous, luminous violet fire in her eyes. She tossed a rusted, heavy-duty floor scrubber, which clattered loudly against the grating right at the commander's knees. She suggested he start scrubbing, as the blood his men had spilled was beginning to stain her new floor. Millions of light-years away, the sun-drenched, gilded spires of the Senate Capitol were tearing themselves apart. Elias's unfiltered, hyper-encrypted data stream was playing on an endless, unbreakable loop across every major civilian holonet and deep space broadcast channel. The undeniable high-definition proof of the Orion Syndicate's blood sport had shattered the illusion of galactic democracy. The citizens of the Core Worlds, who had long tolerated minor corruption in exchange for economic stability, drew the line at state-sponsored gladiatorial slaughter. Massive, violent uprisings ignited in the streets. High Chancellor Vane, the ruthless architect of the syndicate and the man who had signed Elias's death warrant, found his private hyper-yacht grounded by his own security forces. The Senate enforcers, realizing their wages were funded by the sickening corruption now exposed to the universe, laid down their shock batons and joined the rioting crowds. Warrants were issued by independent tribunals. Syndicate accounts holding trillions of credits were frozen instantly. Consuls were dragged from their panic rooms. The entire political apparatus was collapsing under the weight of its own immense arrogance. The moral arc of the universe was incredibly long. But Elias had just reached out from the darkest pit in existence and forcefully bent it toward justice. Back on Tartarus 9, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The crushing, oppressive terror was gone, replaced by the chaotic, vibrant energy of a free and united people. Elias and Lyra stood in the reclaimed botanical wing, the bioluminescent vines casting a soft, ethereal azure glow over the newly established Supreme Command Center. The Warden AI hummed quietly in the background, its vast processing cores no longer calculating mortality rates, but managing the logistics of a thriving, fortified city. The massive monitors displayed a breathtaking new world. Down in the lower tiers, the forges were burning hot, churning out reinforced armor and advanced agricultural equipment. Trade routes between the Kalan and the Draxians were bustling with open commerce. The gangs were gone, replaced by disciplined militias and specialized guilds. Lyra stepped close to Elias, looking out through the reinforced observation glass at the sprawling, illuminated metallic landscape below. She reached out, her hand finding his. Her touch was grounding, a quiet anchor in the massive storm they had created. They had survived the abyss, and they had found something deeply profound in the dark. It was a partnership forged in blood and titanium, a romance built on unwavering mutual respect and the shared heavy burden of absolute leadership. Elias looked at her, seeing the fierce, brilliant warrior who had initially held a blade to his throat. He knew with absolute certainty that he would rather rule this rusted iron wasteland with her by his side than return to the sterile, deceitful halls of the Senate Capitol. They were the architects of a new era. Tartarus 9 was no longer a silent tomb for the galaxy's forgotten ghosts. It was an impenetrable, heavily armed sovereign fortress. It was the undisputed capital of a new political movement, a beacon for every outcast, rebel, and discarded soul seeking refuge from the tyranny of the core worlds. Elias Thorne, the fragile human who was mathematically calculated to die in 3 hours, stood as the absolute boss of the most dangerous domain in the known universe. But a fortress is only secure until a new enemy decides to test its walls. The fragmented, desperate remnants of the Senate loyalists were secretly gathering their loyalist fleets in the uncharted nebulae, whispering frantic rumors of experimental superweapons designed to crack entire planets in half. And somewhere deep within the Warden's newly expanded hypersensitive databanks, a strange, heavily encrypted signal from an unknown sector far beyond the outer rim was continuously attempting to make contact with the new human king. The galaxy had been forever changed, and the true war for its future was only just beginning. Thank you so much for watching this story. If you enjoyed watching a fragile human outsmart a supercomputer and conquer an entire prison planet, please like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Leave the word boss in the comments below so I know you made it to the very end of the journey. And do not forget to hit that hype button so this video reaches more sci-fi fans just like you.